Great. It was really nice talk from the Ian to understand about the how API first strategy works and how you can use Postman. We have another exciting talk from the Nauman. Yeah, he's going to talk about the how you can automating your API governance, and he's the product manager at this Spotlight. Hey, welcome to the stage.
Hey Shreya, thank you. So yes, like Shreya said, I'm Nauman. I'm the product manager at Stoplight. We're primarily building API design tooling and looking to guide companies towards making a design-first strategy. What I'm going to be talking about today is API governance and how to automate some pieces of it. So API governance is a term thrown around a lot. There's a lot that encompasses it. But I'm going to be primarily talking about the pieces that you can really automate and make this process scalable and work better. So, like from the state of APIs report last year, what we could see was the biggest challenges that companies are facing is standardization. So you as you build more and more APIs, especially larger organizations with hundreds of APIs being built, and companies moving towards this API first and API design first strategy and microservices, you see a lot more services popping up, and teams have gone global after COVID and just generally the globalization of companies in general. So you have developers across the globe. It's so much harder to make sure that everybody's following your standards, conventions, and developers who are consuming your APIs don't really like APIs that are different. So your API should feel similar, but companies are facing a problem as to how to do that. So there are many things that you want to achieve with a good API governance program, but the number one goal is consistency. You want your APIs to look and feel the same, and you don't want a lot of differences between these between the different APIs that you're building out. Now, what is good API governance? A lot of companies have started with some sort of a governance program, which might be a central API governance team looking at every API change that's being made, and then passing some reviews. But it really becomes hard to scale because with good API governance, what you want is you want to make the thing that developers you want your developers to do, like follow standards, the easiest thing, but not really feel like it's something being enforced. And that is where the difference between manual governance and automated governance really comes. We've started with a lot of companies have started with governance as a central governance team that reviews all changes, including conventions, how people are building their responses, schemas. But what it really, once you start to build a lot more APIs and scale this process, it reduces the time to market as the central team who's looking at API design becomes a bottleneck. And feedback's really late in the process because a designer's sitting there building these APIs out, and once they're ready for it to be reviewed, a lot of time and effort has been already been spent. So as this feels more like a gate at the end of the tunnel, people would then, what we've seen is, start bypassing the system just because there's not really that much visibility into what's expected of them. And that is where the automation piece really helps. If you can build an automated set of API standards that are helping the governance team, they're out there, well documented. One, people know, or designers and developers know what is expected of them. And the reviews can really focus on the important things and not on these standards or conventions your teams have already come up with. Also, it scales much better because your reviews are faster, the team's not really a bottleneck anymore. So it would be it would be much better for them. Now, what it really comes to is that automation is one of the key parts of an effective API governance program. So how do you achieve this? What can you automate? You can set up an API style guide. What is an API style guide? It is a set of standards which I'll talk about in some later slides, like naming conventions, security conventions that all developers are or designers are uh, should follow. And what should the style guide look like? Not the 80-page PDF kind. This is what a lot of these large companies started with. Like you'd see Google, PayPal, all these large companies having style guides out there. But developers don't really like reading 80-page PDF documents, and going back every time to see what's expected of them. Like how do you do versioning? You open up some documentation page, read it. It is really not that effective. Like we heard in a lot of these other presentations, developers and designers want to focus on writing code, but we really, with API governance, we want to make this an easy process. So you can create an automated style guide, like create a set of rules that can automatically be run against your API designs, and you can see what the issue is. So um, create a style guide, but not the PDF kind, create the automated kind. Now, but what should an API style guide include? What I'm going to talk through here is some themes that you can think of while creating these rules. Every company has different conventions, different things that you're really focusing on when you're building out APIs. The first and one that pretty much applies to everybody is some sort of best practices on using these specifications that have pretty much become a standard. So if you're using OpenAPI or Async API, you'd want to follow some basic best practices. Like an example being, I don't want to use OpenAPI 2.0 anymore. I want to use OpenAPI 3 or 3.1. You can make that as a rule, so that developers know that which specification format they want to be using and which version they want to be using. Adding tags, adding versions, defining operation IDs, adding contact information. These are things that can be easily missed when creating these open API specs. But adding these really increases the quality of these definitions. So all of them can be codified into your style guide. As developers and designers look to create these documents, they can easily get feedback on what they should potentially do to improve the quality of their API specifications. Next, now this is where we get to the interesting bits. You've gotten some sort of AP guidelines on what kind of an open API to create, but a lot of the discussions or a lot of these problems arise around some sort of conventions, which the company wants designers to follow. But generally, it would result in long conversations. But at the end of the day, it's not a case of what you do, but once you decide on one particular convention, you want to stick to it. And that is where codifying some of these things really helps, like API URLs. You want your URLs to look consistent, follow similar conventions. So you can create some rules like I've defined here. Some things for your host. It should always be lowercase, basic stuff, but easy to miss. It shouldn't have a trailing slash. You can have a trailing slash, but either choose always to add a trailing slash or not. Again, otherwise it would result in confusion. You can choose to structure your URL in different ways. Start with API, have a separate domain for your APIs, or put it on a subpath. But it's generally a good practice to follow a similar convention across your program. Now we can see Stripe does it differently, Slack does it differently, Google does it differently. But whichever convention you choose, you codify a rule for that so you can easily follow it. Next, paths. um, Kebab case, camel case, underscore case, multiple ways to go about it. Again, create a rule for it. Don't use file extensions in path. Don't add HTTP methods. You don't want your paths to be looking like get users or get products. It rather those are defined by the HTTP methods itself. So just create a simple rule nudging people towards not using these HTTP methods within the paths itself. Avoid special characters, use nouns for your resource names. So these are things that are pretty standard or best practices in terms of how to create REST APIs, where easily missed, especially as you scale your API program. You might be bringing in developers who are not really that well accustomed to some of these conventions. So putting them in your style guide really helps reduce the developer onboarding time and increase consistency. Same goes for how you'd structure your parameters. Now, all of these rules created, and there are multiple others that you can create, would result in much better looking URLs for your APIs and much less conversation on what these should look like in the first place. Versioning is a big one. There are multiple strategies that you can follow. Some people might want to use path-based versioning, while others want to do it in the URL or headers or query. Like you can see, there's not really one convention that the companies follow, these popular APIs follow. Whichever one it is, codifying it into your style guide would help. And this would really solve this versioning question that most developers would have. You'd have it in your style. This is how we version our APIs. One, two. Let's say we are doing path-based versioning. This is what we intend to do. If you start with a style guide in some codified way, it would be easier in the future to version these paths, even if it's just the V1 that you're creating right now. It would always have the version. So the next time you create a V2, you'd have that ability to easily version APIs because you decided on a strategy, put it in your style guide, which really helps go a long way in terms of scaling your API program. Security, a big one. There's conventions out there in terms of OWASP or the top 10 rules that you can get there, or just general practices. You should always use HTTPS. If you're starting off, potentially not a good idea to allow people to use HTTP basic or OAuth 1. Tell them to use the latest and the greatest in the security world. Always have securities defined on an operational level. It's easy to miss some of those, so create rules for that. Um, Open-ended parameters, like you can leave strings without limits, or arrays, or allow additional properties, which are all security issues that are easy to miss. And putting them in your style guide would really up-level your game and up-level your API security. So another one would be, let's say you're using OAuth 2, you should always have HTTPS on your OAuth endpoints. You should avoid particular grants like implicit or password because they're unsafe. Rate limiting, put it in your style guide. Let's always include rate limiting headers. So with a core set of security guidelines within your style guides, it really helps at least get the basics right. Fill in fill in those gaps that cause 90% of the security issues, and then the rest of the 10% can be done via reviews and other mechanisms, like making sure that your API is secure in other places. Error handling. I think a lot of us who designed or consumed APIs have seen this. You call an API, get a 200 response, and there's an error in there. Please create a rule for that so that there are no errors in success responses. It's just particular types of error responses that are being returned. If it's an authentication error, make sure you return a 401. There's one set of way that you define errors. So you can define the error object type itself. Like, this is how my error object should look like. If you're using problem JSON or some other convention, codify that into your style guide again, because it would really help in terms of making sure developers are getting the right errors, because error handling really helps your developer experience. One big reason why we create open APIs are documentation, like good documentation that we want to provide to our internal or external developers. So basic set of rules: add examples, add descriptions, have a particular length of a description so that you're not putting in one word just to get away with this rule. Put in some sort of a grammar or a spelling check so that uh, easy mistakes like grammatical errors or spelling errors are not just getting through. So you can create a basic set of rules that can really improve your ape documentation that you eventually put out there using an automatically generate a tool that you use to automatically generate your documentation. A good open API spec with all this stuff would result in good documentation and other things that you might generate out of it. You're probably, if you're creating these open API specs, designing them out, you're probably using some sort of tooling downstream, like you might be using a gateway. So that would require you to add some X extensions. Like if you're using Amazon, there's there's X extensions to have service tier information in there or descriptions in there particular to the gateway. You can put those in. There might be gateway specific limitations, like one off is not supported by the Amazon API gateway. Instead of developers or designers putting it in there and finding it out later that it's not supported, you can codify it into your style guide so that your spec or your API design goes well with your tooling that you're using later. Same goes for if you're doing code generation. The open API generator that you might use to generate client or server side code has particular X extensions that really add value. Like enums could have descriptions, which really result in better code. You can codify this all whenever you're adding an enum, add a description to it. And if you're following industry standards, if you're one of those lucky ones who started off with, say, using JSON API or following Zalando, you can codify that into your style guide. If you are in a particular industry which has standards out there, like open banking or IATA in the airline industry, you could codify those. We already talked about some security standards. Those rules could come from a list like OWASP, and really put those into your style guide to make sure that you're following these standards actually, and not just putting out there that we follow JSON API, but then missing out on some pieces. If it's codified into your style guide, you'll be much better off. Now, these are the kind of rules you can create, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. There's multiple other things that you can put into a style guide. Let's say you've created this automated style guide. How would you roll it out? First, I think the first step would be, even before putting it out in the hands of the developer, you can start socializing it. So create the style guide, share documentation within your organization to socialize the different aspects of the style guide itself. These are the rules. This is the documentation. One, just to get feedback on the rules that you've created. Everybody might think differently. Have a good collaborative conversation on it, just to make sure that everybody agrees on the basic set of rules. Start small. You don't need to add all rules at the start of it. Start small, iterate over it over time. Once you've socialized that, the next step would be to build it, bring it where your designers or developers are. Like we talked about before, you don't want developers reading, and they don't like it either, 80 pages, 100 pages of documentation. Rather, something like ESLint, where you get feedback right within your design environment or your development environment. So as I'm building out or designing out APIs, you can get those errors. Say you're using Stoplight Studio, or you're using VS Code, or you're using JetBrains, whatever your preferred way of designing these open API specs is, you can get feedback right there for the conventions to follow. Like, am I doing the right casing, or am I following the right security conventions or not? Once you've given it to your developers in the design environment, this should nudge them to do the right things as they're getting feedback right there. We're making it easy for them to do the right things, bringing it to their design environment. It gets you 80% there, but there still might be things that are leaking out. And this is where the automation process really helps. As part of your review process, you can now put this into your CI pipeline too, like as a PR check. If there are errors, don't allow the PR to merge. Or maybe If there are warnings, at least give a warning to the designer and have a conversation within the review. Why are we not following these? If there's a particular reason, we can still let it go through. But at least this is now automated, and this conversation can be succinct on specific things, and we don't need to be going and looking at each and every one of them. What this really helps with is it doesn't take, like, we still need reviews. There should be some sort of a review process, but the review process can now focus on business capabilities, use cases, developer experience, do making sure that it doesn't require 5 calls to do a basic use case. Rather, it focuses on it focuses on these business capabilities, use cases, and the conventions are taken care of by the style guide and these PR checks. So it really decreases the time that reviews take. It You can get faster to market, and you're hopefully making much more consistent APIs. Now, style guide is just one piece of it, and that is what I wanted to cover in detail today. But there are other things that you can do to really augment your governance process, like create a reusable set of API components, like models, parameters, headers, error responses, things that people can use. This really kickstarts and brings consistency again, because you have a set of things that people can really get started with. The other piece being templates. Once you have some sort of reusable set of components, you have style guides, you can provide templates with best practices and commonly used patterns to kickstart the design process itself. But start with a style guide, and you can always get to these other pieces later. And as you automate and provide more of these tools to your designers and developers, hopefully you'll be building much more consistent APIs. All right, that's it.
Hey, Nauman, thank you very much for sharing everything about the API governance, the points that you have shared about the API style guides, and yeah, it's really learning curves. So we do have a question from the audience. Most of the people wanted to understand that how they can, start with the API governance, because people knows about the governance, but they are really confused that how they can start it, like initiate the API governance process at their organization. Any
All right.
steps or?
Yes, for sure. So I think this automation of style guides is a piece that comes a bit later into the process. Um, for your governance program really to start, the first thing that you can do is make sure that you have your APIs cataloged. If all your APIs in one place, easy to find, you're hopefully using Open API or some other specification to document them. That would be one good step, like bringing some visibility into your program. And the next step would be really identifying these teams or stakeholders or champions, or call me what you may with them, but people who are really responsible for this governance piece of it, people who are responsible for the overall health of your program. Now, once you have said these basic things, like having a catalog, having a governance team of some sorts, they can get started with some of these things. And the easiest that you can do is create a simple style guide to get started with. Like, just put it out there. It's a basic set of conventions that you can follow, and then really improve on it and go from there. And this is one part of the governance process, obviously, the design piece. There's also the other pieces of what kind of tests are you writing? Do you have observability into your APIs itself? Those pieces can come too, but this starting with just the design and simple style guide in a team really helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what's your thought on tools? Like, is there any tools, best practices to follow for the API governance? Any resources that you can share?
Yes. So for style guides, particularly, there are a couple of tools open source out there that you can really get started with. One,
Mm-hmm.
Spectral, used by large companies like even Microsoft and IBM. It's a Stoplight open source tool, and then there's Open API CLI by Reed Dockley. Again, both of them do similar things in terms of creating automated rules that you can then run against your Open API specs. And instead of going the PDF way, you can just use these tools out there and create these style guides themselves.
Okay, okay. Great. Thank you very much, Noman.